All right, I hit record. I'm with Michelle Tracy Berger. Sorry, I will say your name correctly. Michelle Tracy Berger. And it's not that I don't know your name; it's that I can't say names, evidently. And we were chatting, so I just hit record because we've been talking for like 10 minutes, and otherwise we'll just keep talking. And you
We're
were
good at
talking.
dialogue.
That's right. We're just dialoguing together. We were talking about an old community we were both a part of that we both really loved where we met at. Um, and you were on the podcast 2 years ago.
No,
You
I
might
think
have been our
three
first
years ago.
guest. Were you our
I
first non? Now I'm gonna
I
look this up while we talk. You might have been my first non-session guest. Where like we didn't edit anything; we just talked.
it was early. It was March because I was looking it up. It was like March 2021 or something like
Yeah, it was
that. I came
super
out. It was
early,
really
and I think
early,
I had
and
only done sessions. I had never interviewed anybody
what?
before,
And
and
I
you
was
came on as like my first kind of conversation partner. Maybe
and
I might be making
I'm
that up.
no, I'm so grateful to be back, and we also connected because we both are deeply fascinated by dialogue and characters. And I was just
Yeah.
so
Oh yeah.
excited that there was someone at the author level talking about these things. So, and then we talked for quite a while.
Yeah. So Todd, you've had some life changes since you were on. You're in Cleveland now at Case Western. Um,
Mhm.
tell me what that's like. What's Cleveland? Defend Cleveland to me.
Oh my goodness, I don't have to defend Cleveland.
I'm gonna put you on the spot. Defend Cleveland. Um, yeah.
It has more like, okay, so I'll just say I happen to be the director of a humanities center, the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities
That's
at
so cool.
Case Western, which is amazing. I get to talk about amplifying the arts and humanities at a STEM forward place.
That's
What's
cool.
what's amazing in terms of being in Cleveland is the number of cultural institutions. So you have everything from Cleveland Playhouse to the
Mm,
Cleveland Museum of Art, which is, one of the top US and top world museums, which I didn't know. You have a great Metro Park system. I mean, you just have so many things that you have cultural diversity, you have economic diversity. I just have been, as someone who grew up in New York City, and I don't consider myself pretty snobbish, but I've lived in Las
hmm
Vegas, I lived in a lot of cities. I have been tremendously surprised and really animated by all that Cleveland, brings to the table in terms of culture and entertainment
hmm.
and outdoor work. I think Clevelanders have always known how cool Cleveland is, but now the word is getting out and they're kind of like, we it's fine if people don't understand us. Like we get who we are. And I really
Mm.
respect that. So it's been great. Now the winters, I will say, it's a process, Jeff. It's just a
Yeah, you
process.
gotta get used to that, especially
And
coming
so
from North Carolina. You gotta get used
yeah,
to.
it's a
Yeah,
process, but just better outerwear and I'm good to go.
yeah. I think Jay Thorne held a editors conference in Cleveland that I went
That's right.
to, that I
That's
kicked off the
right.
dialogue doctor with, and we had a like. I think at one point there was like a 4 hour break between like the end of the last session and dinner, and I spent 4 hours walking Cleveland, and
Oh,
I walked a
oh,
lot of Case Western.
yeah.
Found a huge cathedral out there that was beautiful. It's absolutely
Yes.
gorgeous. Walked through that. Yeah, so I'm a fan of
Yes.
Cleveland.
Oh, good. Okay, good,
I'm a
good,
big
good.
fan.
So
Yeah. Yeah, and
good.
I thought this is just a funny random story. I was on I got a I was Airbnb-ing it, and I'm a 6 foot pretty big guy, and I'm fairly passive. And so I was like, I don't care where I stay. I grew up in a, you know, fairly rough school in New Orleans. So I was like, I've been around. So I was like, I don't care where I stay. It's fine. So I just found a cheap Airbnb, and I didn't even look at neighborhoods or anything. I was just like, I'll just take this one. This is fine. The pictures on the inside look fine. I was in a trailer park
Oh my
on
goodness.
the up against the Great Lakes. Uh, and it was a rough neighborhood. I was like, oh, wow, I should pay more attention to where I am in cities before I go there. It was a tough neighborhood. And I remember there was one. I've done a lot of work with like in the inner city, and a lot of work with like unhoused populations and addicted populations. And so there was one. I would get up, like I get up at 5, so I'd get up
Mhm.
before we had to be at the conference, and I'd like just try to walk around the neighborhood to find like somewhere to like sit down and write. And there was an old beach right next to
Wow.
where I was.
I have a sense of where you might have
And it
been.
was
Yeah.
like an old, like there were pictures and signs of that, like, oh, this in the like 1930s, this was like a big like carnival area. There was actually like a, and so I kept trying to sit down at the picnic tables that are right there, and several unhoused people kept like coming and sitting next to me, and so I'd like pick up my laptop and I'd go to the next pickup park bench, and they'd like come and sit next to me. We were doing this like leapfrog thing where I don't know if they were like going to ask me for something, or but they were like, I'm going to sit next to the laptop. So I wrote at like 5 different picnic tables at that pier. It was really funny. Yeah, that was my clue. It was very charming. I
I,
loved
I
it. It
will say that
was
there
great.
is it's like most Midwest cities, industrials, like it's a range, and Cleveland is really proud of how the ways in which people really kind of come together
Hmm.
in, different ways, come together in kind of cultural ways, come together in, political ways. So
I had the full gamut.
Yeah, great.
I had a morning in Little Italy where I went down there for breakfast, and
Yes,
it was
yes.
beautiful, like just gorgeous. And I like to just like randomly walk neighborhoods. So I finished breakfast and then I just walked that neighborhood for, I'm sure people are like calling the cops on me. There's like there's this weird old white dude in a back with a backpack just walking around our neighborhood. Can somebody please check on him? But yeah, there was a great
Oh,
cemetery there. I know that's a
oh,
weird thing
yes,
to
yes,
say.
yeah,
Yeah.
a huge one of the oldest cemeteries, I
Yeah,
think.
really cool to walk around and see. Anyway, yeah, so first question for you. We're going to talk about 3 different things today. First
Mm.
question, and the first thing I want to talk about is your like trajectory as an author and like how you've come around, because I think we like to put ourselves as authors in 2 camps. We are like, okay, I'm going the traditional route, which in our imagination means I got an MFA, like a Master's of Fine Arts in literature of some kind. And then I went to New York or like some or Iowa, and I like spent time at a master's program there. And then I like worked as a waitress or as a some kind of like menial job while I slaved over my script. And then maybe I got hired at a publishing house as like an editor or like an agent's assistant. And then at some point my manuscript worked its way through, and then I've been published. But I did it like the traditional route. And then there's the indie route, which is like I watched a whole bunch of YouTube videos and I learned the tropes for romance. I read a bunch of romance books, and now I've written, in the last week, I wrote 45 romance books, and I've published them all, and now I'm a millionaire, right? Like those are kind of the true, like gross stereotypes of, but you have kind of taken an academic path. So I'd love to know how your fiction writing corresponds with your work as a like academic thinker in a career. um is that fair? Is that a fair question to ask? Am I even
So
characterizing you in a fair way?
and I think it compounding that. I love that, description of the extremes is from our generation, Gen Xer. We were talking about that, and
Hmm.
you're maybe on the edge, Gen X or millennial. Remember, we grew up with the writers that, first of all, you remember seeing writers doing book tours on TV and having
Yep.
kind of accolades, Stephen King, Sidney Sheldon. Like I'll go all the way back, Harold Robbins, and so
Yeah.
the idea of like what it meant to be a writer was very much imprinted in a certain way generationally. And I
Yeah.
think what's amazing is, that indie trajectory has changed that. For me, I always knew as a young person that I wanted to write. I did writing in high school. By the time I went to college, though, I really felt this tension between life of the arts and life of the mind. And so
Mm,
for me, I went to a small liberal arts school. I was able to do quite a lot of what I enjoyed, but I was really galvanized by this idea of getting a PhD because a lot of my mentors had PhDs, and also there was that really ambitious part of me is like I knew that only like I don't know less than 6% of the population had a PhD, and when you get for numbers of women of color and Black women much smaller,
mm,
and at the time I really was interested in taking knowledge and bringing new kinds of knowledge into the academy, particularly around feminism. At the time we call multicultural education, multiculturalism. We
mm,
don't call it that anymore, but those things were really important, and I was really torn also between fiction writing. But at the time, and I have to say, no one was like so excited in my college writing classes about Afrofuturism, science fiction, speculative fiction. So I was always the weird one out writing. Now I had
Mm,
support, but looking at the bigger picture at that time, and what do you know when you're, 19 or 20,
yeah.
I just thought an MFA program, I just intuitively knew that the way I'd heard about MFA programs, it wasn't going to be a good fit for me. Not because I
Mm,
wasn't disciplined, but because I couldn't see myself teaching writing, which is often what people do when they get an MFA.
yeah.
But I could see myself going on. I went on and got a degree in political science, and I thought at the time, and I counsel my students never to do, like, I don't counsel anyone to go right from undergrad into graduate school or med. So like I encourage people to do some other things.
Mm,
But I really thought, oh, I can do both, Jeff. Like I can get a PhD and have an academic career and write. And obviously by the time I got into the program and then became a professor, being an academic is its own full-time thing, right? So it
hmm.
wasn't until really my 40s, by the time I had established myself, that I was able to, I never stopped writing, but I was able to carve out more space for creative work. And so
Hmm.
I did that. I found literary community, which is so important. I started submitting my work. I refined my work. I stopped working what I call metaphorically in the basement, where you're just kind of like, I literally was, and I think I said this in the other episode that we did, like I literally for a while was rewriting parts of a 400,000 word novel. Yes, 400,000
Yep.
words. And I just kept thinking, oh, I can teach myself, and I go to craft things. And it took me a while to make space for the work,
Mm,
to then know what I was doing with the work, and then to start on that submission path. And I feel really fortunate that now in where I am is that I can integrate, like as a director of Humanities Center, people love the fact that I'm a creative writer. I don't have to sort of hide the scholarly and
mm.
the creative. And even though I've mostly been traditionally published, I am also interested in indie publishing down the line for my nonfiction, but that's a separate.
Yeah, yeah. I'm interested. So would you, as somebody who's kind of gone this path of like, okay, I had to establish myself professionally before I could make room for my fiction. If you had a student who's like 19 or 20 and like considering, you know, pursuing a harder professional route like a PhD versus like getting an MFA, what would your advice to them be? Because you're around a lot of young people still, and not like me. The only young people I'm around are my children. They don't want to talk to me. So, like, if you're around a lot of young people still, what would your take to them be? Like, what's the route now?
I really I think so many young people, because of the larger conversation about, you have to match what you're doing in college to a career,
Hmm.
get very twisted up around some of these questions. It's understandable because we have pressures on us and family expectations. I really believe that unless you're called to do a PhD or an MFA, you
Hmm.
don't need to do it right coming right out of college. I really believe that people should get other kinds of professional life experience and professional experience
Hmm.
before going on to graduate school. So that's just straight across the board. However, for MFAs, the whole MFA landscape, Jeff, has changed. So
Hmm.
I intuitively knew writing speculative fiction or science fiction, it was going to be very difficult for me to find support, right? Intuitively knew that. I also intuitively knew as a person of color at that time, this is in the early 90s, I had other friends who went on to do an MFA. Those were difficult places to talk about some of the and write about some of the things that I knew I wanted to write. So intuitively, I knew those things. Now, the MFA space is a different space now,
Hmm.
and so I think it's much more inclusive. It's much more interested in, like, not just going through a very traditional literary, perspective in terms of fiction.
Hmm.
You have more programs that deal with kind of commercial fiction, genre fiction. So I think it's a more interesting, there's some great online programs. So it's a more interesting landscape. So I'm not as opposed to helping people think through that. But I definitely think if you're going for an academic research career, to understand, it may take you a while. It's not going to having a writing career outside of what you do as an academic is something you really have to fight for and think about early on
Mm,
and find people who can support that. There's much more. The last thing I'll say about this too is that in academe, there's much more support now for being a public writer and a public thinker. So people want you to translate your work, so to speak, into other spaces. So
mm,
that was different than when I was going through and getting my degree.
yeah, and you know, likely different because people like you change the landscape as you came through,
No,
which is great.
I just went from one. I tell people, I got my PhD in political science, but then I came out as as an undercover sociologist, and I have an MA in women's and gender studies. So I just now I get to study the things that I want to study, talk about the things. So I just kind of
Yeah,
stayed long enough, Jeff, to find spaces that people got me and I got the work. And
yeah, yeah. How are you feeling about? I'm going to get to you writing short fiction in a
uh,
minute because I want to talk about that a lot. But before we get there, another thing you said was that like moving into speculative fiction and Afrofuturism as an author for you felt kind of different and odd than what was popular at the time when you and I were coming up, which is super true because if you had asked, yeah, like I think still, if you ask Mid Journey to draw a picture of a writer, they're going to give you like a white man at a typewriter. So like, I think that's still kind of like, that stereotype definitely exists. The promise of, and I'm not asking you to like speak authoritatively on this, I just want your personal experience. The promise of Part of the promise of indie publishing was that it was going to open the doors to everybody, and that this idea that you had to look a certain way, be the right socioeconomic status, the right color to be seen, and if you weren't the right color, um the right race, then you had to write a specific type of fiction, right? Like we wanted, the black narrative, quote unquote, that was usually like inner city crime of like, people yelling at each other and um, lots of drug addiction type stuff in that genre in the 90s. How do you feel about where publishing is now? Do you find there's more space for Afrofuturism, for like kind of the beautiful picture of like fiction that gives a different portrait for what it means to be black? How do you That's what I associate Afrofuturism with, by the way. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But the Afrofuturism writers I know always write from a place of like, hey, we're not going to write, we're writing beauty and like creativity and strength. Not, we don't want to like necessarily explore the sins of the past all the time with our fiction. We want to talk about, future power. So do you mind talking about that? If not, I can just cut this out of the podcast.
yeah.
Just delete this. No, why did you ask that question?
No, I so appreciate it. And people also, I would add joy in that in terms of what people write about.
Yeah, joy's a good, yeah. Yeah.
I think there's two different pieces. So indie publishing has just completely reshaped the landscape for what we know in terms of genres, mashup genres,
Mm,
subgenres. And I know you've also had many authors who are talking about, the work that they do around different kinds of identity communities, affinity communities. So I feel like we people are creating those markets,
mm.
right, from an
Yeah,
economic
yeah.
standpoint. And so that's really, I love them. People like, for example, Jessica Cage, who's just killing it, who's doing just a lot of work in speculative fiction, genre
Mm,
fiction, who's an indie author, and she's on TikTok. People should follow her. Like, I don't understand. She does all the things. And so I think on the indie side, there's so much more support and innovation that happens. I think on the traditional publishing side, there are gatekeepers now that are have signaled they really want to create an inclusive publishing space,
mm.
and also the other thing is that other gatekeepers they're new gatekeepers now, right?
Yeah.
And so I'll just give an example. And I think for people who are listening or watching, who are emerging, sometimes you can actually be ahead of the curve. And
Mm,
so, for example, there was a story that I wrote, which was it's in the collection, and it's basically trying to reimagine what was it like for the Brown versus Board of Education, the dolls that were used that,
Oof. Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and so I created this kind of contemporary fantasy in the 1950s, but it's got
Mm,
dolls and toys and hierarchies. And I believed, if I believed in that story so much, it was rejected probably for 10 years. And I got refined and refined and refined. And it landed at FIA, the magazine of Black speculative fiction. They
mm,
took it immediately. I had an amazing editing experience. And then it won a major award. And so, not to say that I was just the writer in my dreams when I first sent it out. So maybe 10 years ago, it needed a lot
mm,
of work. However, I know for so many people in my generation who are writers, particularly writers of color, writers coming from marginalized communities, there's something that shifted because the same work that no one seemed to be able to recognize, connect with. I just think I think editors are better informed. I think people read more voraciously because I'm like, if you don't,
that's great.
so I want to say that that's a really positive thing in many ways.
Yeah,
And I think people are reading across different literary canons because if you don't know anything about contemporary African American fiction, then you might not understand some of the things that I'm doing. Now, every reader brings different things to a text, but like
mhm,
if we're not conversant across some, particularly in the US, some different literary forms,
mhm,
we won't always recognize, I think, some of the excellent work out there for what it
mm.
is. So that was
That's
that was
great.
a long,
No,
long
that
answer.
was a great answer, and thank you. I know that there was a question I didn't prep you for, and I'm just like dropping random questions on you. But
That's great. That's
yeah,
great.
I appreciate you being open about that, and I hear you saying that you see progress in the industry, which is a good thing. Um, haven't arrived, but that there's whatever arrival looks like someday, but there is progress, which is good. Um, yeah, and I think that's very hopeful for a young writer starting off to hear like, hey, it is possible for your voice to be heard. Even if you're ahead of the curve, if you feel like the world hasn't caught up to you yet, it's possible for you to be heard, which I think is great. I think that's really great. Um, okay, so you have published a lot and bent a lot towards short fiction, um, which is part of my I can't remember if you and I've talked about this. I also started writing short fiction. um I didn't have the patience you had.
Oh,
I wrote and so when I started writing in my late 30s, mid
Mm,
30s, late 30s, it was 9 years ago. How old am I now? It was
mm.
late 30s. um
You
I
young and you.
I'm am I feel old. When I started writing in my late 30s, I started by writing a short story every night. That was my thing. It's like I'm gonna
Mm,
write 2,000 words every night. I'm gonna crank
mm,
out a short story. I did that for a year. I came out with
mm,
like 250, 300 short stories.
mm, mm.
And then I like went to publish them, and I read submission guidelines, and I was like, I'm impatient. I don't have time for this. So I just started publishing them on my own. I was like, I'm just gonna put them up on the internet, and everybody's gonna love them. That's not what happened, but that was my idea. So, but I still have a deep passion for
Mm.
short fiction. In fact, the Dialogue Doctor just opened a new literary journal.
I saw that. I saw that. I was
Yeah.
like, okay, he's not getting any sleep, but he is just passionate and doing stuff. I'm like, when does this man sleep?
I have a great team of people that are actually serving as the editors. There's like 9 people that are serving as the readers slash editors. So I don't have to read anything, which is nice. I mean, I have been reading, but I don't have to. There's a team of people that are doing that. But, um, and part of the reason we started it was to be like, it's important, I think, for my journey as an author to understand how to construct a scene at like the 2,000 to
Mhm.
4,000 word level, like even the 7,000 word level, how to like construct a story at that level. Because if you can do that, you can write a novel. Is kind of my opinion. Like if you can give me a solid 2,000 to 4,000 words, then you can write a novel. Anyway, that's just me ranting about short fiction. What is it about the
I
form that
love it.
you love? What's driven you to that
Well,
form?
first I have to say, I don't think I knew that you did the 200, like write a story every week or every day for a while. And that self-training is so powerful. I feel like I backed into short fiction because in my mind, I always wanted to be a novelist. And then I went to Clarion when Clarion, so Clarion, the well-known science fiction kind of summer camp, boot camp writing
Hmm.
program. There's now it's only Clarion West. There used to be Clarion East, Clarion West. Now
Okay,
there's
you
only
got to tell me more about this because I am completely, as you just
oh
heard from my origin story, I am completely uninformed about all things writing. I have no idea. I came in like a hammer. I was like a bull racing in. And then I moved from short stories to novels, not because I wanted to be a novelist, but because I was like, I don't really have a good job. My children don't have food. I need to make money. Nobody's paying me for this short fiction. I clearly need to write novels. That also, by the way, anybody listening to
I
this,
love
putting
that.
the burden of money on your creative pursuits is a really bad idea. No one should do what I did. I tell people all the time in the community, I'm like, don't, this is what I did. Don't do that. Don't do that. But anyway, so I'm
That
all,
was
so I have no,
hilarious.
you just said the word clarion, and the closest thing I know to that is the hotel chain. So you have to explain to me what that is.
So Clarion is a very, I think now very prestigious science fiction or speculative fiction writing camp that people go to for 6 weeks,
Cool.
and you
Six
have to,
weeks.
yeah,
That's awesome.
you have to apply to. At least it was 6 weeks back in when I went in the late 90s. It was and it was held at one was held. It was called Clarion East, Clarion West.
Okay.
One was held at Michigan State during the summer. One was held in Seattle, maybe at University of Washington campus in Seattle. Now, the Seattle, the Clarion West still exists. So I
Okay.
applied as a graduate student, and you had top authors and editors. So the editor, Gordon Dozois, I think, famous editor who passed away now of the magazine of science fiction and fantasy, would come.
Hmm.
So they'd have an editor or an agent come, but every basically 1 to 2 writers, faculty members would guide a group of 20 students, so to speak, to work on short fiction. And the idea was to come up with publishable short fiction. And Octavia Butler went, many decades before I did and came out with a publishable short story. That was one of her
Wow.
first short stories. And
Okay.
so Octavia Butler also taught in Clarion West. I mean, some of the top
Gotcha.
sci-fi people. So, what's amazing about that and funny, so I go there and I get in, I go there. It's intense because you're eating, sleeping, breathing speculative fiction. And, you have people who are in their
Sounds
40s
awesome.
that are there. I
Yeah.
mean, it was so amazing. And so like people are drinking and just, like it just was great. However, I left like every time I tried to write a short piece, Jeff, it became like a novella. So in some ways I failed.
Hmm.
um, because I just everything just
Just
sort
blew
of
up.
balloon. And it
Yeah.
took me a long time to, like you say, learn how some of the scene building pieces. And I'll never forget a wonderful teacher of mine, Ruth Moose, who's also a poet. She just kept saying, okay, think about the short story is this wonderful dinner party. She's like, think
Hmm.
about the length of a dinner party. And people are having a good time, you invite them in, and but they go home. And I said, oh, that's the issue. I'm writing stories where there's sleepovers and like, there's multiple things happen. And then she said, like when you have a quick affair, that's flash fiction. I mean, she had like this great whole template.
That's great.
So I really had to work at it. And the other thing in terms of what you were saying about getting published, short fiction is a way to get published. And so if people can nail that 3,500 and
Mm.
under form, there's a lot of places to get published. However, it then takes like, learning how to do that. And so it took me quite a while to do that. So the collection actually has a number of longer pieces in it.
Mm.
I do have flash pieces, but I started getting published when I kind of hit that, like under 5,000 mark and really kind of worked on that craft. And then I became obsessed with doing flash fiction, which is, obviously really compressed, which is
Yeah.
which is also really fun. So I feel like I studied short fiction, but I also studied novels.
Mm.
But I just doing it so much, kind of like what you did, it teaches you things that, you can only do that by actually applying the techniques.
Mm. Yeah. 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 I think, It's interesting you're talking about like short fiction blowing up into multiple spaces. When I first started publishing, I had like publishing my own short fiction. I had a somebody in the UK like noticed it and was like, "Oh, we want to take a couple of your pieces and turn them into radio dramas." And I was like, "Okay."
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm telling you, my publishing career is so manic. I was like, "Okay, let's do that." So it's great. And I remember on the radio drama they were talking about, because they did a couple of them, and they were talking about like, oh, these are great because he writes one room fiction. And it had
Mm-hmm.
never occurred to me, but short my pieces were always short because they were one character interaction. You had two characters, three characters, one conversation in one room, and they ended if they left the room or if the conversation ended, the piece was over. That was it. So like I was it was just a
That's
funny like
that's that's great. Like that, like simplifying, and then you get to focus in, right? Because you don't have to deal with all the setting and like that's fantastic.
yeah,
So you are already doing a lot of the things that
yeah, but I
work
think
in short fiction.
I think it's like the reason I shared that is because I think it's like you're saying our natural tendency, I think, as writers is to create drama, conflict, energy through expansion. If I
Mm-hmm.
make this longer, if I make this bigger, if I take them to the next room, if I take them to the next place, if I take them to the next thing, this will be like more. Like it'll be like a bigger, stronger piece. And I think part of what I hear you saying is hard about short fiction. And part of what I learned through writing short fiction is that like if you can nail each conversation, if you can nail each moment, like you were saying, like
Yes,
with flash fiction, like if
yes,
you can nail 500 words of character interaction, then your novel is just a whole bunch of 500 word exchanges. Does that make sense? Like it's just
absolutely.
nailing that 500 words over and over and over again, and then you have a 40,000 word piece. Like you just keep nailing it until you get the, yeah. Um,
Absolutely. No, that is absolutely true. And a person, I don't know if you know them, or know their work, but Kelly Link is
no,
someone.
wait, maybe.
She gets written up in the New Yorker when her books come out. She's speculative fiction. She gets published in literary as well as genre journals, and she's amazing. And she has several collections of short fiction.
Yeah.
And you
So in
might
the
like
in the dialogue
like
doctor community, we like do a twice a month Zoom call and
Mm.
we'll take a piece and we'll like we've done several Kelly Link pieces. So I
Oh,
don't
okay. That's
know
yeah.
her,
That's yeah.
but
Yeah.
in the dialogue doctor community, we've studied her work a lot. Yeah.
I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. Yeah, it's just she's just amazing. So I was just that she just kind of came to mind in terms of someone who can just get that um really beautiful, that 500 word, that scene level, and it's so sparse, but it's so
Hmm.
full. It doesn't, I don't I think we all have natural tendencies too about length and style. But trying to look at the piece and say, okay, what can leave, what can get cut, is really powerful in terms of revision for work.
Yeah, and I think if anybody's listening and they're looking for an example of like a Kelly Link story to read, I think her website has the fairy handbag for free, which is
Mm,
a good
mm-hmm,
one.
mm-hmm.
And that's a solid one to read. She takes I'm just going off of memory. I'd put it at like 6 or 7,000 words, but she
I think
takes you
that's right.
through multiple interactions with characters. Each one is about 1,000 words in it, and she nails every single one. So there's
Mm-hmm,
this like, I think again, like building small to big.
mm-hmm,
Um, we so as we were like prepping to talk today, you had mentioned, speaking of somebody who moves his book from one conversation to the next.
mm, mm,
You had mentioned Walter Mosley.
mm.
Um, I told you I hadn't read him before. Oh, you got it out. Nice. I told you I hadn't read him before. I've actually read The Devil in the Blue Dress.
Oh,
Um,
that's what I figured that you had given.
yeah,
Also, you write across crime and noir and like I figured you had
yeah. I
some of
just
his
hadn't.
work.
I just didn't. I'm terrible with names, so I didn't remember. Like, oh, that's Walter Mosley. But I also read. We read for this one. I'm going to script the title. What's the
Trouble is what I do.
Trouble is what I do. Which is his New York-based detective, which was
Yes, yes.
fantastic. And I
Oh, I'm so glad you liked it.
so good. It's such a good book. And there's so many things that like I loved about it. But making the transition from
Mm,
short fiction to what he's writing, because he's a novelist, but I really did feel like reading it. This author nails every interaction,
mm, mm,
every character
mm,
interaction. is this fantastic conversation that's full of conflict and great characters. And yeah, so let's transition, talk about Walter
Yeah.
Mosley a little bit.
Yes.
What do you like
Okay.
about him? What draws you to him as an
Well,
example?
just I'll just set up for people who may not know. Walter Mosley has written over 40 novels. He's written nonfiction.
Hmm.
He's written a couple plays, and he's best known for the Easy Rawlins series.
Yeah.
And that was made in Devil in a Blue Dress was made into a film with
Hmm.
Denzel Washington, and that stars that's about Easy Rawlins, who's a war hero, World War II hero who goes lives in L.A. and really it's set in the 1950s, and the series moves him across decades. And
Hmm.
Walter Mosley has said that he really was looking to create African American male heroes because they were
Hmm.
missing in the literary canon. And so I love him. I love him as a fan, but in the last several years, I've really studied his writing
Hmm.
because he not only, I feel like he's at the level of, Neil Gaiman or Nora Roberts. People read them because they have they don't care what they write
Yeah.
because you're going to get, history and memory and the entanglements of race, class, gender. Like and human emotions. He just does all of that so well. And
Yeah.
I'll say I know I sound like a true fan. I will say the last thing just that I wanted to share too as we get into this is that my husband and I we have a practice of reading aloud to each other,
Hmm.
and I we just like doing that. But as a writer, I'm very attuned, and as I know you obviously to dialogue and how things move on a page. And Walter Mosley, you can read him aloud and have such a deep sensation of the work, right? So you can read it, but then if the work really translates to our ears. So
Yeah.
and the trouble is what I do is a standalone in his Leonid McGill series, and Leonid McGill is a private investigator, sort of like Easy Rollins. It's set in New York, contemporary period, but he's a little on the shady side. Like
Yeah.
he's
He's more
got
criminal. Yeah.
he's
The,
Easy Rollins is very heroic and
mhm.
just doesn't break the law but does things to help other people. Leonard McGill is a former boxer, right? So, and
Yeah.
I love what you said in that because as I was rereading parts of it, when the greetings, the farewells, he always is lacing through dialogue character and
Hmm.
all of that, in these ways. And he uses every opportunity to ground us. And the way he does it with dialogue is so powerful.
Yeah. How would the one that we just read, how much would what percentage of that book would you say is character interaction versus
Well,
like,
it's funny. I was looking through it, um, and it has. Well, we should also say just a little bit about the storyline is he gets approached by this 90-year-old blues man,
yeah.
and the 90-year-old blues man wants Leonid McGill to take a letter to his granddaughter. And
Hmm.
without giving too much away, it's really about the granddaughter doesn't realize that she has African American blood and
Hmm.
descendant from this whole community. But it's also about a lot of other things. But I would say, and it's a short novel. That's one of the reasons why I was like, oh,
Yeah.
you
I put it at like 20,000, maybe 30,000 words. It's
yeah,
tight.
maybe it's really tight, but
Yeah.
it's not that like there's page after page of dialogue, but as I was going back, the way it's layered. So I don't know.
Hmm.
What do you I want to
I'd
say
put
at
it
least
like, so we define
yeah.
dialogue as like character interaction, not just people talking.
Right.
So
Right,
like
right, right.
I'd put it at like 80%.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's a high character
Mm,
interaction. Devil in the Blue Dress is the same way. I think I have a
mm,
feeling it's just Walter Mosley's style.
mhm,
Very
mhm,
high, but part of what I love about what he was doing, and we can trade off things that we like
mhm,
about his style,
mhm,
but one of the things I like about what he was doing is you're talking about greetings. He has the classic detective noir thing where the detective's expertise has to do with his history. So the
mhm,
detective
mhm,
is always either an ex-cop or an ex-con, right? Like it's always one or
mhm.
the other. And they have this like network of people that they've like been engaged with in the past. And so part of what's great about the greetings in each character is If it's a brand new person, this is something I noticed he
Mm,
does in this book. So you can tell me if he does in his wider
mm,
work. If you're meeting a new person for the first time, you typically have a pre-conversation with a throwaway character about who he's about to meet.
mhm,
And what
mhm,
that lets, so there's a
mhm.
receptionist that's like,
Yes, I
you can't meet with this person.
right.
This person's too important for you to meet with. Or there's a woman on the street who's like, he's the best looking man I've ever seen. And it's these short throwaway conversations with characters that don't even really get names that
Absolutely.
but what it allows him to do is it allows him to introduce a character without paragraphs of exposition about who that character is, because the vehicle like lead character can have this mini conversation about the person he's about to meet and get all the background information in about that person and all the description of that person into a character interaction, and then walk into the room and go right into the important character interaction with the character you're talking to. Does that make sense? So he did this
It,
interesting thing where he's like, side character conversation about, main character we're about to meet, so that I can get all of the history and everything that, like, as writers, we want to put in like a paragraph of like, this is what he looked like, and this is what he sounds like, and this is what he has this side character being like, that guy looks like this, and
mm,
he sounds like this, and he's scary, and he does this, and I know this about him. And then you go into the actual conversation prepped, but what he's doing is he's taking away the need for exposition by keeping it all in character interaction, which I was like, this is brilliant. Like yeah, it was really
I
brilliant.
I love how you're breaking that down because it's so helpful to understand what he's doing at the craft level. And you're absolutely right. In some of the places that I marked that I when I was going back and reading it, it's really about those interactions. And you get, I think because he does it so well, you feel grounded, even though you like there's one receptionist who he meets who, he has this kind of flirtation with, and but you feel grounded, and these are really everyday people,
Yeah,
across the network. And you're right, it because they you have that interaction. No one feels like a throwaway. I will say no one feels like a throwaway character,
no,
but like you said, it preps us for the main event conversation
yeah,
interaction. You're absolutely right. That's so I love that insight because that's so this book in particular. Um yeah, and he then will he's not afraid as a writer. Sometimes this is to me the downside of people who've taken a lot of creative writing classes or MFA classes, because we get that people get so they start to doubt things. You can tell the audience things. You can tell the reader things. He's not afraid to do that. Neil Gaiman has said this in his masterclass. You can tell the reader things. You don't want to tell and tell and tell and tell and tell.
yeah,
But that's the other thing I think he will do well when there's dialogue. There's also sometimes just straight up telling, but
yeah.
it's so um insightful that you're okay being told that, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and part of what you're saying, I think his emotional content, like on the
Mm,
craft level again, is
mm,
if it has emotional content and it's something that like the reader's going to enjoy and experience in, it's in character interaction. It's in the
mhm,
dialogue. If it's a
mhm,
fact that we need to know, or it's like something that moves the story forward, but that is just like a component of the story that's not doesn't have emotional teeth to it, it's told to us, right? Like, so he doesn't need to, there's no, he could have had a conversation about who the Daughters of the Mayflower are, which is a
right,
big,
right,
he could have
right,
had two
right,
people go, I don't know what that organization is. What is it?
right,
And somebody,
right,
oh, well, it's this. And he'd be like, oh, okay,
right,
well, what did I do in the
right.
history?
Yeah, this is
But instead, he's like, you know what? There's no emotional tenor to this. I'm just gonna tell you, this is who the Daughters of the Mayflower are. Here's like three sentences. All right, let's keep moving to like the stuff that you're actually going to connect to. I think there's a strong balance between like understanding what the reader's showing up for, right? Like the
mhm,
reader's
mhm,
there to have the, like there's a scene where the blues musician and his like cadre of people, and then our detective and his son and his they all start singing together,
Mm,
right? Like,
mhm.
and it's this beautifully written piece where they're all like filling in each other's words like you do in a blues song. It's really nicely done. It's completely irrelevant to the novel. It's got nothing to do with moving
Well,
the plot forward.
no,
It's got like,
no, right,
yeah,
but it has it has emotional weight for
yeah,
leaving, and then he does return to that later on in the story, but it is this kind of improvisation almost in the middle of
yeah.
that
In the
that
middle of this book,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, and that's also why I thought, oh well, Jeff is going to enjoy reading this because he also breaks rules, or not that there are rules, but when you're first starting out reading the novel, he actually takes you to a long flashback, right, about
he
a-
does.
and
Yeah,
you're at first you're like, what's going, I mean, you're enjoying it because you're learning stuff, but kind of rules about, well, you don't take the reader back and you got to, but it's like you can get away with things if you're Walter Mosley and you do it really well.
yeah. Well, I think the way he's getting away with it is that flashback isn't told to us in like paragraph form, where it's
Right.
like
Right.
paragraph after. He takes us to the interaction. He's like, I was waiting in the hotel room. He came in. This happened here. This happened here. He said this. I said this. Right? Like we're in the heart of the moment. So as
Yes.
opposed to like giving us a flashback where you're like telling us all the ways that he's interacted with the Mississippi assassin before, he picks like two events and then we relive those events. So it doesn't even feel like a flashback. It feels like a present scene, if that
Mm,
makes sense.
yeah.
I
Oh,
actually, in the
nice.
middle of the hotel scene, I was like, is this whole book about the like? Are we going to do the whole book in the past? Which I was here for because it's a very like. I think what I'm trying to say is I think the thing we confuse about that expectation of like no flashbacks is we're putting flashback versus having a moment of character interaction because the assumption
Mm,
is the flashback is going to be exposition. It's going to be
mm.
paragraph after paragraph. But if
And no
we
one wants that. Yeah.
nobody wants that. It feels
Nobody wants
heavy.
that.
Yeah, I tell people you get five. You get five paragraphs before somebody starts thinking, starts flipping the page to go, how much longer are we going to do this? Right? Like you get five paragraphs, sometimes eight. If you're writing science fiction, you can have like nine, but like after that, you better get to characters interacting, or we're like skimming and skipping, and we're like, when do they start like talking to each other again? Like, when do I get to the actual? And there's an instinctive thing with the reader of like, I know the part of this book I'm going to enjoy are the characters interacting with each other,
Mm.
not the like prose of the exposition of like summaries of what happened in the past or what. So I think that
We're
rule to
looking at you, George R. R. Martin, who I for some of
man, but what I will say, what makes his books, I think, engaging is that there are very powerful moments of character
Oh
interaction.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh yes,
There's just
absolutely.
too goddamn many of them. But there's
There's- well,
there's
and there's such fine detail around very obscure, something that does become important like a couple books later, but in the actual reading of it, it's this the wall of text.
I don't know. I might fight that. Sometimes it doesn't become important at all. Sometimes it's just I mean he still has books to write, so like maybe it will, maybe, but there's total things that he takes off on where you're like, wait, why is this kid with the bull helmet? Why are you talking to me about orphans in the middle of the woods? What does
Right.
this have to do with the story at all? And yeah, anyway, sorry.
Oh
That's
no,
another, yeah.
I know. I just it's just
You'll get me ranting
funny.
about Martin. Yeah. What else? Was there anything else about Mosley's work that stands out to you that's like, this is a great example of this thing?
This is something that it's not necessarily related to dialogue per se, but something that my husband, who's a very astute reader, he talks about the indictment paragraph. So where, and this is somewhat true in this novel, but truer in other novels, where you're reading along, and when the character is sometimes ending a paragraph, when Mosley is ending a paragraph, it can be a searing indictment in terms of it's such it's an insight often about something larger than just what has just happened,
Mm,
and so he does that often at the very end of the paragraph, Sometimes he'll do it at the beginning of the paragraph, and it's just a for it just creates, I think, this sense of we really understand what Leonid and or the main character cares about, and he
Hmm.
kind of wraps that up for us. And I'm sure other authors do it and do it in a different way. It's just that it as my husband and I were reading through his work, we just saw that in a lot of different ways. So it's some of it, it's sometimes it's here, but it's also in his other work. And
Interesting.
I just find that yeah, it's sort of like the gut punch, you know. Like sometimes I know for me as a writer, I'm trying to do that the incredible lead in to to a paragraph, right? Because I want to earn the reader's attention every single line.
Hmm.
But I'm not always doing it. I might be doing it at the end of a scene, but I'm
Yeah.
not always doing it at that very end of a paragraph.
Yeah.
So,
I think part of what makes that really strong is his like narrator voice, the vehicle's voice
absolutely.
is has strong opinions and is processing the world at the same time, which I think is a hard
Yes.
thing to pull off.
Yes.
The like
Thank
there's
you.
a
That's absolutely
yeah,
right.
there's like a I am I know how I feel about things, and I don't want to say anxiety, but I have questions about how things are going to happen, right? Like the what you're talking about with that
Mm,
indictment paragraph, I think every time the narrator talks about his son, the paragraphs always end with like
mm,
this
mm,
punch of like, you know, I think one of the ones that sticks out to me just from
mm,
memory is
mm.
he has a phrase about, well, when your son's a criminal mastermind, what are you gonna do? And it's not a joyful. It's not like
Right.
a my son's a criminal mastermind, isn't that great? It's like a this is my kid that I'm having to like try to set straight, and it's really difficult for me because he bends in this direction, right? Like it's a, you know,
Mm.
yeah. Or there's a great conversation between him and his son that starts off about why his son took a gun to a hotel.
Yes. Yes.
And he starts off the conversation saying, talking to my son about why he took a gun to a hotel is like playing Go, where every you have to sacrifice territory in hopes of getting the upper hand on him. And then they're having this conversation, and he kind of works his son into a corner. He's like, look, I would appreciate if you feel like you need to take a gun somewhere, just tell me you feel like you need to take a gun somewhere. And then he says, and my son waited for 100 seconds before he responds. The kid like waits for 100 seconds in silence, processing things. And then he says, okay, I can do that. And then the ending line of the paragraph again is coming back to like, and that's how conversations with this kid are. I never know where we're going or how they're going to end, right? Like, or if I want it or not. Like, it's this great, like, kind of what you're talking about. The
Yes.
like giving
Yes.
the lead in is great to the interaction of like setting this up for like this is what this conversation is going to be, but then concluding the conversation, giving us that like internal reflection from the narrator of like I'm still unsteady at the end of this thing. I'm still
Eh,
processing the world.
I just I'm nodding and I'm loving that. That's such a great frame, and that particular conversation is so good. It also, I guess, one other thing that is evident in what you just said. Mosley is a master at similes and metaphors,
Yeah.
and very, very colorful ones, very, profound ones. And that's true in much of his work. And I've been reading a lot of his more recent or later work. And I just wanted to note that because that he uses like it's like having conversations like playing a game of Go, right? Like
Yeah.
who would think to do
Who would think
I
of it?
just it just is it's that it makes me as a writer, and I don't know if you felt like this, but when you read something that is so skillfully done, you just want to amp your game up. You start thinking, do I use similes really well, or do I use it, metaphor? Like you just kind of and do I have that crispness in the dialogue? So it just
Hmm.
it kind of elicits this feeling of like, oh, I want to take what I've learned from here and get to the page and
Yeah,
yeah.
I think another thing I love that he's doing that was one of those craft things that I was like, oh my gosh, I need to do this more. He skips steps that don't matter.
Mm,
So,
mm, mm.
for example, they're like, we need to go to this diner to go sit down and get something to eat and sit down and have a conversation. As I sip my cup of coffee, we don't need that. We went down the stairs. We walked down the street. It was a hot day outside. It was like the street was blah, 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 blah. The
That's
traffic
me.
was busy. I walked into the diner. I sat down at the table. A waitress came over. What
And
would you
she's
like to eat?
wearing this,
Yeah, I
right?
like coffee. Right. Like he's just like, we need to go get something to eat. As I sip my cup of coffee at the diner, it's like, oh, yeah, you skipped all the things that we didn't need. Right. Like we're just going down there. Or there's a scene where he delivers a letter to somebody and all of a sudden he's in the ballroom,
Yes.
right? Like he's just
Right.
there. I'm like,
He's in
oh,
the
we're
right. He's in the kitchen, like he's in someplace else trying to get set up, and then all of a sudden, yeah, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. It's
He's
like,
like,
oh,
and then there she was across the ballroom.
yeah, yeah.
I'm like, oh, and it's not jarring. We're talking
No,
about it like it's jarring. It's not jarring at
no,
all. As a reader, you're
no.
just like, yeah, that's what I need. I don't need to know that they're like walking down the street of Manhattan. I just need to know like, and I don't need to know that he like went up the elevator and was anxious in the elevator and then stepped out into the. I just need to like, yeah, there she is in the ballroom, and it's that like getting to. It reminded me a lot of
Mm,
Vonnegut's thing of like
mm,
get to start as close to the end as possible.
mm, mm,
He's getting to the character interactions as fast as he possibly can. He's like,
mm,
I don't need any of this in between. All you care
mm,
about is the detective's conversation with that woman in the ballroom. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter. The elevator ride up doesn't matter. The hallway doesn't matter. None of that matters. All that matters is this thing. So I'm going to take you from the conversation in the kitchen that really matters to the next conversation as quickly as I possibly can.
and
I don't need
and
anything else.
and the woman, right? So he's in the ballroom, and then as he's trying to get to the person who's going to deliver the letter, he has this interaction with a drunk bridesmaid, or
Uh-huh.
like a bachelorette party or something. But that's very short, right? And
Yeah.
then we're back to he's getting now closer to the person.
Yeah.
You're
And it's one
right.
of those throwaway conversations we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier that actually
Yes.
sets up who he's going to talk to. Because he talks
Yes.
to the bridesmaid, and instead of like giving us paragraphs of setting the scene, the bridesmaid's like, in summary, this is where you are. This is who you're talking to. This is who these people are. And it's like, oh, okay, great. And then he goes to the conversation that matters. And we skip all of those paragraphs of like having to have like this setup of the room and how it felt and what the smell was and how, the food on the tables and like those things that I think we naturally want to write because we're trying to
Mm,
bring the reader into the experience,
yes.
not understanding that what the reader actually connects to is the characters interacting. And so,
Yes.
like, if we can get to the character interaction as fast as we can, we get this very fast paced novel. Because what's funny about the novel to me is not a lot happens, but it feels very fast. It feels action packed. And I think the reason it feels action packed is we're moving from one interaction to the next. We're just like driving from one character conversation to the next. Yeah.
That is so true. And I will offer that if you want a very different experience of Mosley, but you see some of the same techniques, I just finished The Last Days of Ptolemy Gray,
Ooh,
which is a
I'll check that out.
very different kind of novel. It is dealing with a 90-year-old man, but he has dementia, and
Mm,
he's very confused in the beginning. There's no chapters. It's actually a really
mm,
interesting
that sounds fascinating.
yeah, it's a deep book, but you still see some of these same techniques that you're talking about, even though the book is a lot bigger than this one. You're moving through time and space because of those character interactions, and a young woman becomes an important person in his life. And yeah, so
Yeah.
but you're right, this is like very fast paced, but you're meeting a lot of people, and things are happening, but not at the same level of, his Easy Rollins novels, or maybe some of the other things
Yeah.
that.
How did you feel about him? So in this book, something I noticed right away as I was reading is that the first gunfight happens off screen. How did you feel about that?
I it's funny you said that, because I was like, Huh, that's so interesting that it was, we didn't get to see that. We didn't,
No, he doesn't need to show you. He doesn't
yeah,
feel you're at the detective's office. They go off to the hotel to get something.
right.
We're in
And
the
then,
emergency room.
right, and then you're like, but wait a minute.
Yeah.
And then all the things that ensue after that, right?
Yeah.
But he does not go through that at all, which no, you're absolutely right. But I also think he's not, the main character is not personally involved in that scene.
Yeah, but
So
that's a choice.
that's true. No,
That's a
that's
choice
true.
he made as
That's
an
true.
author to keep that main character out of that scene.
That's true. That's true. So,
Yeah.
and you just have to wonder, but you're not, you don't feel like you miss anything because you're like, oh my goodness, are people dead? What's happening? Like you're just kind of in the, with the doctor and finding out,
Yeah.
with the other folks.
Yeah, I liked it because for me again it just stressed to me like, okay, Mosley as an author understands that
Mm-hmm.
like the characters interacting is what's I don't need 3 pages of a gunfight.
Mm-hmm.
All
Mm-hmm.
I need are the characters interacting. And if
Mm-hmm.
they're telling me about the gunfight, it is like being in the gunfight. If the
Mm-hmm.
characters are interacting around it. In fact, it might be better than 5 to 10 paragraphs describing a gunfight. Does that make sense? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
that character. I loved it. I was like, this is brilliant. I don't need to see
Sure.
the gunfight. I need to see them talking about the gunfight. And that's what actually drives the like suspense of the because he's not using it for suspense. Like I
No,
think if you want
no.
it for suspense, if you want your lead character to be terrified, you have to put your lead character in the gunfight. But that's not what he's doing. He's using it as like this thing happens to up the stakes of the to let you know that
Yes.
like people might die in this
Yes,
novel. Yeah.
and prior to that, there's some dangerous people involved, but you don't. This kind of reaffirms, and then his son, as we were just
Mhm.
talking about the other scene, his son has took a gun, which he didn't know, and
Yeah.
so you find out all of that, those pieces, and those that continues to evolve through the novel.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought it was really masterfully done. I was like, this is yeah.
I'm so glad this was a good.
Yeah. Anything else about it that stood out to you?
um,
There doesn't have to be, but if there was something else you wanted to share.
I think we covered kind of all the main things. I
Okay.
just well, I will say just that in terms of the structure, you realize novels, we all know as fiction writers, novels can be about anything. However, when you read Walter Mosley's work, you are reminded even crime novels can really be about these other things because,
Yeah.
it is about trying to get this letter to this person, but it's also about history and memory. It's about father-son
Hmm.
relationships. It's about a number of things. It's about race and culture. But and it's a standalone. And yeah, so I appreciated that it could be this in some ways very small story that is built. There's so much around that, the
Yeah.
story itself.
There's definitely an ongoing theme too of those, I would say in the narrator's voice, those of us who have come up the hard way versus those of us who have come up the right way. And
Nice.
there's definitely like
Nice.
a theme of like I had to come up through this criminal side, and he interacts a lot with this character called the Mississippi Assassin, who they kind of share the same lineage, but then all of these people that he needs favors from came up in his terminology the right way. They came up through like more legal structured channels to like get there. So there's definitely a theme of that running as well, of like the societally accepted way versus the way that some people had to do it. And it's that like contrast there, I think was really fun too.
And
Um,
you as the reader, I love that what you just said, because we as the reader get to the narrator is sometimes saying, here's how I feel about this, but we as the reader get to make our own judgments about that, which I
yeah,
love, right?
yeah,
Like and that's also something very masterful, because sometimes I just want to pound a point in for the reader.
yeah,
No, and I've say no, Michelle, no, we're all smart, people are
yeah. They'll
subtle.
figure it out. Yeah, yeah. So tell us about you have a new anthology releasing called Dolls on October 4th.
Doll seed.
Doll Seed.
Yeah,
Sorry, Doll
that's
Seed.
okay. Doll
Talk to us
seed.
about that. What's coming out?
So this is my first collection of stories. They're all speculative and they span horror. I do some psychological horror, contemporary fantasy, sci-fi. I've got longer pieces in there. I've got flash fiction. And some of my themes, somebody, I have some early reviews and someone said, this is a reflection, this is about characters struggling with anti-blackness,
Mm,
anti-race, yeah, anti-blackness racism. And I just thought that was really interesting because it's about a lot of things. And
mm,
it's not that I don't think it's about that as well, but I'm really interested in how people take up these themes. So I have some alternate history
hmm.
stories where we meet Zora Neale Hurston, the wonderful writer who
Yeah.
is trying to get secrets because she wants to write these great stories. So she gets someone from the Cotton Club to dance with her and to do this ceremony, and they conjure up the spirit. Things get out of control. And what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I have the
Conjuring spirits, nothing's gonna go wrong. Everything will be perfect. Yeah.
it's gonna be great. I have stories about the Brown versus Board of Education dolls, kind of
Mm,
reimagining that. So I think it's got a number of things that are somewhat contemporary, but also grappling with our past and ideas of trust and sacrifice and what does freedom really mean to us as a people, as a collective people of Americans as well as African Americans.
yeah.
So it's got a lot of different layers to it. It's
That's
got a,
super fun.
I'm really excited about. I feel like kind of going back to our early part of the conversation where typically in people like they publish their novel first and then they then publish a short story collection.
Yeah. Off
It's
the short
okay.
order collection is like, here's all the ideas that didn't work.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
It's like,
It's great. But it's okay. It's like we
mm,
can do things our own way, Jeff. Like
yeah.
I feel like people I was really hung up on that.
Mm,
And it's just so nice to be at a stage in my career where we get to make it up as we go along.
yeah.
And a lot of these stories, some of the stories were previously published, and then there's some new stories in there. And the rewriting process
Mm,
was really powerful because different editors see different things.
yeah.
So I got to really hone some things and see the work from a different perspective.
That's exciting. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
excited
you.
for you. Okay, where can people find your work if they want to go look for you online?
Oh my goodness. People can find me at a couple of places. I have an author Facebook page. It's my full name, Michele Tracy Berger. I'm usually posting some cool stuff for writers there. I have a blog and website that's going to get revised. It's called the Practice of Creativity. It's going to be a new redone website soon. I'm also on Twitter at Michele T. Berger. And I'm also on Instagram at Berger Michele 2005. And
Nice.
it's Berger Michele with one L,
Okay.
Michele.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I'll hit stop on the recording. We can talk a little bit more, but thanks so much for coming on.
This was such a gift. Thank you, Jeff. It's really fun.